Hi, welcome to the British Academy. My name is Simon Goldhill and I'm the Foreign Secretary of the British Academy. And today's event forms part of the Academy's Global Perspectives series, in which we invite distinguished figures from around the world to share their knowledge and expertise on matters of global interest and concern. We launched this series in 2014, and these events are possible due to the generous support from the St. Lee Fund. And our previous speakers have included Noam Chomsky, Mahmoud Mamdani, Michael Ignatieff, and Mary Robinson. And it gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce the next speaker in the series, Professor Seyla Benhabib. Seyla is the Eugene Meyer Professor of Political Science and Philosophy Emerita at Yale University, Senior Scholar in Residence in Columbia Law School, and Senior Fellow, Columbus Center for Contemporary Critical Thought at Columbia in New York. Now, Seyla's going to give a short talk, the title of which you all know, and then she and I are going to talk in conversation for around 25 minutes or so before we're taking some questions from you, the audience. If you do want to ask a question, could you submit it through the Q&A section? You won't be able to ask it in person, you have to type it in. And you're welcome to tweet during the event if you want to, and can copy in the Academy's Twitter handle at British Academy. So with no more ado, it gives me great pleasure to ask Seyla Benhabib to start the conversation with her short talk. Seyla.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Simon. And of course, thank you to the British Academy. It's an honor and a pleasure. And I only regret that I have not been able to visit the Academy in person since I have been in the corresponding fellow, but I do look forward to that particular occasion. My brief talk today seems to be appropriate to our times in two ways. We celebrated yesterday International Women's Day, and here we are with two of the most impressive and formidable intellects of the 20th century. But there is also a poignancy to be talking about Emigré political thought at this point in time, because one more time war is in Europe, and we are experiencing a new generation of human beings who have been driven away from their homes and who have become refugees, just as Hannah Arendt and Judith Shklar were. I'd like to begin with a brief presentation of their biographical stories that may be known to many of you, but nonetheless, I think that their biographies reflect such parallelisms as well as subtle differences that it is worth focusing on this. Hannah Arendt, born in 1906, Hanover, Germany, died in 1975. These are some youth pictures of hers. And let me just go back for a second. Judith Clark was born in Riga, Latvia, 1928, and died in actually New Hampshire, United States, in 1992. Just sort of as a working title and also as a stimulant for a conversation, I want to recall Harold Bloom's famous phrase of the anxiety of influence. Are we dealing with a case of the anxiety of influence in the relationship between, particularly in Shklar's relationship to Hannah Arendt? Let me remind you of a few stages of Arendt's life, which has been made the topic of a couple of movies, and biographies of her are readily available as well as videos. Hannah Arendt's life was like a movie of narrow escapes. In 1933, she was arrested by the Gestapo and subject to an interrogation for several hours because of some work she was doing in the Berlin Academy archives for some Jewish organizations. That very day, upon being released, she left Berlin for Prague with her mother, and then from Prague she traveled on to Paris. In Paris, she was a stateless refugee. And Hitler had, of course, denationalized the German Jews. In fact, she was a stateless person, as my next document will show you just for a second. This may not be that easy to see, but it's an application for an affidavit for a passez-aller in lieu of a passport to the American authorities in order to be able to travel back to Europe, where she indicates in Article 8, her statelessness. But back to the biography for a second. When France falls to the Nazis, she is first imprisoned in what is now called Vélodrome d'Hiver in Paris, and then subsequently she is sent to the camp at Gours. And the Gours camp in the south of France has a women's section and a men's section. Her husband and Walter Benjamin, the famous literary critic, are in the men's section, and she herself is in the women's section. And in the chaos of the Nazi march into France and Paris, she manages to walk out of the camp with a group of other women led by an Austrian communist by the name of Lisa Flitko. And this part of the biography is truly like a movie. She walks and rides a bicycle and runs into her husband, Heinrich Blücher, by mistake. They were looking for each other, but they didn't quite know where they would meet. And then very briefly, she manages to cross the mountains to the Spanish border. And again, as some of you may be familiar with the story of Walter Benjamin, there is a period of time when Franco closes the Spanish border to refugees, and this allows them to travel further to Portugal. And it is during one of those closures that Walter Benjamin takes his life, but Hannah Arendt and her group is able to travel over the Pyrenees onto Portugal and New York. So these are some of the biographical details of her escape. Now, Judith Shklar is, in contrast to Arendt, the details of whose life are now quite public and are being mulled over by many generations of scholars. Judith Shklar was an extremely private person. Our source of knowledge about her basically goes back to two sources. One is the Charles Homer Haskins lecture that she delivered at the American Council of Learned Societies in April 1989, in which she wrote the phrase that one day her father came to her room and said, "Your childhood has come to an end." Shklar's family, and this is not unimportant, I think, for understanding her life and her writings. Shklar's family were both German and Russian Jews, but she grew up in Riga, Latvia, just as Isaiah Berlin and other famous Emigré. But also equally remarkable is the fact that Shklar's parents were both doctors. Her mother was a pediatrician. She had actually been educated in Switzerland, and Shklar had two sisters. She grew up in a very well-educated and professional family. The second source of knowledge that we have about Judith Shklar's life is this remarkable set of interviews in the Murray Research Archives at Harvard University, located in Radcliffe College, that was conducted by Judith Walzer. And Judith Shklar is among some of the many Harvard women faculty who reflect upon their experiences at this time. And I will come back to this question of gender in a second. But let me just move the slide forward. And I just want to talk about the so-called northern route of emigration. Shklar and her family leave Riga for Sweden. Then they travel across Siberia to Japan, and then take the ocean liner, I guess, from Japan to the west coast of the United States and come to New York. Shklar's older sister has been admitted to Columbia University, and the family hopes to be able to stay in New York for a period of time, but Shklar's older sister dies, and the family is unable to obtain a visa to remain in the United States. And so Shklar ends up going to McGill. The family migrates to Canada. At McGill, she studies with the noted Rousseau scholar, J.B. Watkins, who is a former student of Carl Friedrich, who will become Shklar's dissertation advisor at Harvard. Basically, Shklar arrives at Harvard as a graduate student from McGill at the age of 21 in 1949 and remains on the faculty at Harvard until her death. But she is not tenured after finishing her dissertation. And Carl Friedrich explains to her that being a young woman, that there is no chance, in fact, and Shklar talks about this in the interview explicitly, that she will become a full member of the faculty. Instead, she accepts to be a part-time lecturer and proceeds to have to raise a family, 3 children, and writes many, many books. Now, Judith Shklar wrote on Hannah Arendt on 5 different occasions. And they met, I believe, at least twice in person, but Shklar was the junior scholar, younger, 20 years younger than the towering figure of Hannah Arendt. And she stood in awe of her. It's interesting, and this is what prompts me to reflect upon these 2 thinkers together and to raise this question of Emigré political thought and the complex issue of gender. But when one thinker writes about another 5 times, various essays of various lengths, then you have to ask yourself the question, what exactly is the attraction? What exactly is the communication? There really is no dialogue, because to the best of my knowledge, Arendt never responded to any of Shklar's reviews. I mean, this may require some further research, but to the best of my knowledge, Arendt really knew about the younger scholar, but did not much note her. So Shklar's first essay on Arendt is actually, I mean, I find all of Shklar's writings on Arendt quite astonishing, is a very good review essay of Arendt's collection of basically exercises in political thought on tradition, on history, on authority, called Between Past and Future. The second longer piece of writing is actually called Hannah Arendt's Triumph. It's actually not longer, forgive me. The third is longer. Hannah Arendt's Triumph, published in the New Republic upon Hannah Arendt's death. And the one occasion when I saw Judith Shklar lecture on Hannah Arendt was in New York City when I attended the annual Hannah Arendt Symposium as a graduate student, and Shklar was presenting a paper on Arendt at that time. And this is a very elegiac and very sympathetic piece, and I will refer to it. The second is, again, rethinking the past in Shklar, Political Thought and Political Thinkers, where Shklar goes back to the question of Arendt's analysis of the past, and in particular, she's concerned about two things. One is she is concerned about why Arendt stylizes the ancient past, the Greeks, and in fact is so dismissive at times of the moderns. This is not true, of course, of all of Arendt's writings, and my first book on Arendt in 1996 was called The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt, where I argued that she was not just, quote unquote, an antiquarian political thinker, but also had a complex theory of modernity. But Shklar comes back to this question of the stylized presentation of history in Arendt's writings. Now, the next set of writings are quite different. In 1983, Judith Shklar writes an essay called Hannah Arendt as Pariah, originally published in Partisan Review. And this essay is a long disquisition on Elizabeth Young Bruhl's biography of Hannah Arendt. But it also indicates a tremendous break on Shklar's part with Arendt, and I will come to this in just one second. The last piece of writing is a brief essay on Hannah Arendt's lectures on Kant's political philosophy, where Shklar criticizes Arendt's understanding of Kant. But let me come to what I sense as the tremendous shift and a break in Shklar's evaluation of Arendt. In 1975, in the essay called Hannah Arendt's Triumph, Shklar writes on Arendt, she was, quote, the very last and finest voices of a shattered culture. Now there is no one left who can speak about and out of the depth of the experience of German Jewry. She was one of the last survivors of a spiritual republic whose social history was as terrible and brief as it was intellectually radiant and enduring. End of quote. So there's a profoundly moving encomium to not only Hannah Arendt, but to her as a representative of this spiritual republic whose social history was terrible and brief. Now, 8 years later, Hannah Arendt as Pariah, here is what Shklar says. Arendt clung to a bizarre notion that being Jewish, quote, was an act of personal defiance and not a matter of actively maintaining a cultural and religious tradition with its own rights and patterns of speech, end of quote. And here Shklar is referring to Arendt's analysis of the parvenu and the Pariah. I will not go into great detail right now in order to leave room for the conversation, but Shklar finds bizarre that Arendt describes herself as a self-conscious pariah. And she writes, American Jewry is a flourishing community while German Jewish culture died with Hannah Arendt, end of quote. She further goes on to marvel at the arrogance and, quote, at the extraordinary ignorance with which Arendt, quote, generalized wildly about the infinitely complex and diverse communities of Eastern Europe, about whose history and structure she knew exactly nothing. I hope you share my astonishment at this claim, which is about Arendt's historical analysis about the final solution and the Holocaust in Eichmann in Jerusalem. Now, this is really the first time that Shklar mentions the Eichmann trial, except for the brief references to it in her book on legalism, where she says, well, the Eichmann trial does not play a role in international law. It's past or future. It was always, quote unquote, a Jewish affair. But what is happening here was Judith Clark as well settling accounts with Arendt after many years, as many were tempted to do. Arrogance and extraordinary ignorance with which, quote, Arendt generalized wildly about the infinitely complex and diverse communities of Eastern Europe, whose history and structure she knew exactly nothing. That's not quite an astonishing claim. Actually, Arendt has frequently been accused of arrogance, and there is a lot of inter-ethnic rivalry and antagonism here, which one also senses in many ways in Isaiah Berlin's writings, brief references to Hannah Arendt, but that's a topic for another discussion. But what is astonishing is the charge of extraordinary ignorance, because certainly whatever one can be said about Arendt's treatment of the behavior of the Jewish councils in particular during the Holocaust, it wasn't extraordinarily ignorant. It may have been wrong-headed and unsympathetic. And I agree with Shklar in that. But Shklar claims it's just like she's raising the ante almost. She says more than ignorance and dissociation, which itself is an interesting choice of words here, which aren't displayed in this essay, she had also caused, quote, pain and justified outrage. She meant to inflict the first. Inflicting pain is cruelty. And she need not have been astonished at the latter. So just some final thoughts on cruelty. In her treatise on moral philosophy, Ordinary Vices of 1984, Shklar wrote, how can we be expected to endure the humiliations inflicted by an uncontained snobbery? Remember Arrogance. Our only consolation way may well be that without moral aspirations, there would be no moral hypocrisy, and that without trust, there would be no betrayals. But there is nothing to redeem cruelty and humiliation. So there is nothing to redeem the cruelty that Shklar senses in Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. Shklar, I think, finally lost patience with the towering figure of Arendt and was willing to indulge neither Hannah Arendt's weaknesses vis-a-vis Heidegger, nor her snobbery regarding Jewish difference and the dilemmas of assimilation. I have not said much about the Arendt-Heidegger affair. I will leave that to our conversation. But one question that emerges in between the lines of this review is, should we allow ourselves judgments about women's personal lives? Is that what Shklar is upset about, that Arendt found it in her heart to be able to forgive Heidegger? Or is it rather that what Shklar is really upset about is that she, like many other New York intellectuals, participated finally in what Irving Howe, the famous editor of Dissent magazine, called the Civil War among New York intellectuals, and said the controversy will die down, simmer, but erupt again and again. So how do we think about the relationship of these, impressive women thinkers, how do we begin to untangle Emigré histories, rivalries, ethnic hostilities, also from the larger question of gender, narrative, and intellect. Let me stop here, and thank you for listening, and I look forward to our conversation, Simon.
Thanks very much, Seyla. That's super. And I have lots and lots of questions and lots of routes we can take through what is such an interesting pairing of two fantastically strong women that are very suitable for Women's Day. Can I start with just a simple question about the question of what she meant by Eastern European, the ignorance and arrogance? How much of that is to do with Berlin versus Riga, in your view? Because after all, Riga is the great center of Talmudic scholarship and has a very complicated set of internal relations between the different Talmudic schools, where of course Berlin was not only highly secularized, unlike Riga, but also famously dismissive of the Ostjuden who came over. So I wondered how much of that was, as it were, living out the European past rather than her present.
That is really quite a fantastic start for a conversation. I mean, I hadn't quite thought about that dimension, Simon, but there is no question about the fact that Shklar learned Hebrew as a child, and she knew Yiddish, both German and Russian Yiddish, and this comes out. And although not religiously observant, she was more of a conventional Jew. Undoubtedly, there is this tension between Riga and Berlin and the different orientations, different intellectual traditions and orientations. And there is also the fact that Arendt refers to the German Jewish leader, whose last name escapes me, in Berlin, of the Judenrat at one point as a kind of, as a Nazi Führer. And this was also deeply, deeply offensive. I mean, particularly, I think Arendt really botched up the question of the Judenräte, the councils that were appointed by the Germans to facilitate the movement of the Jewish population to the camps. She was careless, and yes, her choice of language was almost cruel. So this is the historiographic debate, but to go back to the essence of your question, Shklar came from a different orientation, and although herself not a Talmudic scholar, to the best of my knowledge, she never wrote about this, but she simply was much more connected to a deeper East European tradition of Hebrew and Yiddish. And she said, well, Arendt had German Bildung and knew ancient Greek and Latin.
That's right. And I think that might be part of the difference that they're talking about. But I wonder if it isn't something slightly more theoretical as well, in the sense that what I associate Judith Shklar with is a real sort of a realist politics that goes all the way down. Whereas with Hannah Arendt, that moved back towards Greece, that moved back towards the ideal city, towards a Platonic tradition that she gets from her Greek, of course. I wondered whether part of their argument is to do with that in the end, Judith Shklar saw Arendt's idealism or her politics as leading her away from the everyday, the realist politics that she was so committed to.
Definitely. I mean, I think that Shklar has a kind of irony and realism, where I said somewhere, is more characteristic maybe of East European writers and novelists. So this raises the large question, what about what about the Greeks? And of course, to be talking with you as a professor about this issue and Arendt is quite tempting and daunting. I have always, I am of the view really that part of Arendt's reflections on the Greek has to do with her understanding about the methodology of philosophy. Mm-hmm. She, in her most Heideggerian moments in the Human Condition, her book of 1956-57, we find constantly these locutions, the origins of the term politics, the origins of the term economics, the mistranslation of polis, koinonia politica, in the Middle Ages. She is working with the history of words and concepts in order to get at their transformation. The history of their transformation is for her reflective also something about the nature of the phenomena. Okay, and I think that this is a dimension of her work which goes largely, ignored. I mean, is it a good way to do political philosophy? Well, some of it is inevitable. I mean, I don't know how one can do political philosophy. And if I may invoke a very unlikely ally here, Quentin Skinner, who also writes, for example, about the history of concepts and the significance of the history of concepts, but without maybe this more sort of Heideggerian element in Arendt's thought, at least, in right after the war. I think there's the origin. What is at the origin? Why does it matter? The Greek concept of politics at the origin. And she, can we really reconstruct the history of politics as a story of forgetting? And Shklar is quite sharp about this in several of her essays on Arendt. As I mentioned, she loses patience with the stylization of her historiography, and chides Arendt for just like not being equally subtle in her analysis of modernity and the history of the moderns. Shklar's realism, to come back to this question, because there has been a lot of discussion of realism, of course, in Shklar via Bernard Williams's own approach to realism. I think that actually Shklar is a psychological realist. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure how much of a political realist she is, in the sense that when one looks, at her writings across, she doesn't really work with the history of institutions, except for her book on legalism and a little bit the book on American citizenship. Nor does the concept of power play such a major role in Shklar's work. So in what sense is Shklar really a realist? As I said, I think that she's a moral realist, but I'm not sure that she's a political realist in the sense of either focusing on institutions or on on power politics.
Well, let me try you on this sentence from Judith Shklar, because like you, I find the Ordinary Vices a very interesting book, the 84 book. She says, to forget the mundane, the quotidian, is to forget liberal politics, which are the practices of peace and compromise, not of war and revolution, all to be sure within the limits of possibility. So for me, the way I understand that is that for her, to be a truly liberal political theorist, you have to engage with the daily business of interaction amongst humans. So I think, it's where her psychological realism is the basis of her political realism, which is where the more you compromise, the more you understand the individual relations, the less you're going to get involved in war and revolution. And of course, one of the great enemies of Shklar's book is Machiavelli, who she has no time for in many ways, who you might say is an arch realist at some level. So you're right that her realism is particular, but it's a sense of that quotidian, mundane life of human interaction. And I wonder whether that isn't where she found Arendt falling short. Because in one sense, you can't imagine Arendt talking about the quotidian or the mundane in that loving way and see that as a basis of a politics. So, as you said, I think Arendt rather enjoyed her towering status. And I rather think that Shklar rather enjoyed her performative humility. And so I wonder if that isn't part of the, there's a politics to that, but I think there's also a personality clash on that. Does that make sense to you?
Well, except to say that Arendt did not come to her towering status easily. I think one has to have some sympathy, some empathy for the narrow escapes of her life. The fact that her, I don't know if I want to go there, but there's a certain sadness also in her youth and in her childhood after having lost her father and her grandfather early. There is a story of need and poverty when they first come to New York. She's the only one writing for newspapers like the Aufbau, which is for the German Jewish community.
Sure.
And her husband is not making a living. He never, but in any event, she's the bread winner of the family for many years. There are tensions, particularly in those early years of immigration, of living with her mother in close quarters. So what I want to say is that she did not come off the boat being a towering figure. And, she earned it and she worked for it. And I think that we need to keep that in mind. And also, like Shklar in this respect, she was giving visiting appointments. And very often she was the first woman to do this, the first woman to hold the Gauss lectures, for example. Okay. And she did not have much financial security until very late in her life. So this question of her Germanic arrogance and so on that circulates around her, I'd like to take that down a peg. But nevertheless, leaving aside biography and psychology, there's no question about the fact that Arendt's conception of the political is heroic. She is focusing on those extraordinary moments when sort of the light shines and the sort of the darkness and the tragedy of politics can be avoided. Whereas Shklar, indeed, in the wonderful passage that you cite, is looking at the politics of the quotidian and the capacity to make compromises, the capacity to adjust, and the capacity to to live with the small give and take that all liberal politics would ultimately involve. But my sense is that we really have to keep both perspectives. I mean, as a political philosopher, I do not want to have to choose, in the sense that I think that to reduce politics simply to a quotidian sort of interest politics that was so pluralism or interest group pluralism that was so dominant in the 1960s in American political science, and that has just completely, sort of basically shown itself to be quite hollow, because even interest group pluralism rests upon some deep and profound assumptions, as John Rawls showed us, about what we think politics is, about the concept of citizenship, about the capacity for accepting each other as beings capable of a sense of the good and cooperation. So there needs to be a lot more depth, even to the foundations of this kind of quotidian liberalism. And I think that Shklar, I mean, she's best known for now the liberalism of fear, but I think it's wrong again not to see that Shklar herself had a more elevated understanding of liberal politics as aiming to eliminate injustice. Surely The Faces of Injustice was written in conversation with Rawls. So I guess to just sum up what I'm saying is that yes, there is a real contrast. There is a real contrast there. But Shklar herself, increasingly, I think also, there's a dimension of depth that made liberalism possible. And even the liberalism of fear rests on something beyond and other than fear. It's not the heroic politics that Arendt thought about, that's for sure.
So if you think of the Vita Attiva as a sort of heroic politics that is designed for the individual to go ahead, it would be very easy to contrast that with the role of empathy in Shklar. That idea that, as it were, the focusing on snobbery, humiliation, and above all, cruelty, it's very much a question of interaction and empathy. And I think the accusation that's often made of Arendt, that she really wasn't very good at empathy, might be, again, explain some of the strength of feeling that you rarely get in Shklar, but that she expresses towards Arendt, might be because she saw in Arendt the way in which that commitment to a Vita Attiva led to a lack of empathy that Arendt herself then performed.
We come back to the question of Kant in Arendt's work. And the reason is that in her final lectures on Kant's political philosophy, we see a dimension in Arendt's work that we know was actually there from her earliest diaries, the Tagebücher, right? I mean, we're putting all this picture together again. And Arendt was very concerned, and I do believe it's one of her important insights about politics as such, but surely for liberal politics as well. She was very concerned with the question of the enlarged mentality, what Kant called the erweiterte Denkungsart, the enlarged mentality. And she thought that the enlarged mentality was fundamental to politics and not just for morality, as Kant thought. And the relationship of the enlarged mentality to empathy is that Arendt thinks that empathy is obviously a psychological disposition, and one may or may not be capable of it. But she emphasizes, and in this respect, she's a cognitivist and maybe not a very good psychologist the way Shklar was, but she emphasizes the capacity to take the standpoint of the other. The enlarged mentality is the capacity to see the world through the other's eyes. And she considers this to be essential to any kind of thinking about the political. That in politics, we must be capable of entertaining different perspectives. This is what she means by the plurality of the human condition. Plurality is not pluralism in the sense of interest group pluralism, but plurality is perspectival plurality, the different position that we have in the world and the different perspective that we bring to our views of the world. So this is not empathy, it's not unrelated, but because it does involve this communicative and interactive dimension. Okay, so in other words, whatever Arendt says in The Human Condition about Achilles' story, the ancient historians, narrating immortality and so on. There is also this very important concept in Arendt of the web of narratives, that we tell the story of who we are via narratives, and that these narratives are constructed, the web of narratives are constructed through the interweaving interaction of different points of view, and the one who acts is not necessarily the narrator, the best narrator. And that's the point at which she cites Aristotle, just going off the point when she says that it is a lucky person who knows really what kind of life they have led, or something to that effect, that where Aristotle is talking about how one's children can sort of do or undo the story of one's life. And so I think in Arendt, as I say, it's a more cognitivist position, but it is not just, the walls of the citadel smashing hero. No. I think that there is also this definitely more interactive, communicative dimension in her work.
Thanks. We're reaching towards the time when I hope the audience will provide us with some extra questions. So if you are in the audience and would like to ask a question, please do put it in the Q&A and it will come through to us and I'll put them to Seyla. But before we get to that, I hope the directions of my questions are clear, because your final point was, to what degree should we be reading these women through their personal lives, as it were? And I suppose what I've been suggesting in each of my questions is that their personal lives were something that they themselves theorized as being absolutely crucial to their own politics, explicitly so in the case of Shklar, with her interest in narratives and the way she used those, and the same in different ways with the way in which Arendt talks about the vita attiva. So both of them claim that the way you live your life is actually crucial to the way you might understand as well as embody political theory. And thus, if one could take it round back to your very first sentence as well as your last question, it would be to say that here in these two writers, we find the most theoretically sophisticated foundations for what often became a rather trivial catchphrase, that the personal is political. So I'm not surprised that you asked the question, should we be reading these women through their personal lives in some way? And of course, I hope that's not done in a trivial way. But I do think both of them offer us a very strong sense that to do political philosophy is to think about your action in the world. And they both did that in very different ways, but that's where they come together. Does that make sense to you?
Well, I think that's a wonderful summation of my own intuition and approach. I mean, biography, integrating biography and theory is always difficult for fear of reducing the one to the other. But on the other hand, political thought and political experience cannot be so easily dissociated either. And I think that in the case of what I call Emigré political thought, the stupendous nature of the experiences that they have gone through, must be reflected in that. But to come to the phrase, the personal is the political, and maybe this is an issue that I'd like to raise. Simply, we haven't talked that much about the gender question. Arendt basically took the position of the emancipated woman for granted. There was no argument for her about who she was, about what she was going to do, about how she was going to lead her life. And there's the anecdote that her mother, who was a relatively educated woman, but certainly not as educated and as professional as Judith Shklar's mother was, her mother took her to listen to Rosa Luxemburg in Berlin when Rosa Luxemburg was giving one of her famous and fiery speeches. So there are the heroes and heroines in Hannah Arendt's work. It's not only the Greeks. There's also the towering figure of Rosa Luxemburg, about whom she writes lovingly. A wonderful essay in Men in Dark Times, oddly titled. It's astonishing that way. I mean, whether it is necessity or just freedom, and the kind of person who she is, that Arendt did not think it necessary to think about this. Now, when one comes to her concept of politics, and this is something that irritates young or feminist scholars, who Arendt says in politics you have to defend yourself under the category in which you were attacked. So she defended herself as a Jew, and went into Jewish politics. But she never quite considered women as political subjects. For her, the category of being a woman was not a political category, and that is something that definitely irritates. And with some justice, there is no analysis of gender in Arendt's work. Let's just leave it at that. There just isn't. I mean, you can work with her concepts of the private and the public, and you can subject it to a gender critique. But that's all fine, but it's not going to go very far. What I find interesting in Shklar, and I'm pretty convinced of this, both through personal conversation, since we were colleagues at Harvard, I was a junior faculty. Shklar was quite aware of gender discrimination as a form of injustice. She had suffered it in her own life by simply becoming, being made a lecturer instead of getting the appointment that she deserved. And finally, Harvard University President Bock appointed her Cowles Professor of Politics. She was aware of the nature of gender injustice in her own life, and in some of her most recent writing, also in the Faces of Injustice, also American citizenship in particular, you begin to see the question of professionalism, wage earning, and the kind of standing that gives you, right? So I really, I do believe that for Shklar, I mean, had she lived, she died very young, had she lived long enough, that gender injustice would have come as one of the faces of injustice.
Right. That's interesting. That's interesting. And do you think that Shklar noted that lack then in Arendt?
No, I don't think so explicitly. And I think she found Arendt's relationship to Heidegger and what Arendt wrote about Heidegger, despite everything that she knew, the meaning.
Yes.
And I particularly, she does say in one footnote that she was under his influence. And for Shklar, this definitely was a problem. I think Arendt, in this respect, disappointed her.
Yes. For me, that comes back to the central chapter of Ordinary Vices, the topic of betrayal. I think she felt betrayed by Arendt, in a sense, that the return to Heidegger after the Second World War in particular, and going back to Heidegger in that sense, he must have felt like a betrayal in some senses to someone she so admired at the beginning.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree to that. Yeah, I think betrayal and and maybe a breakdown of solidarity, right? And just like Jewish solidarity that she believed in. All these dimensions are there undoubtedly, and that may explain, I think, some of the bitterness of the writing Hannah Arendt's Pariah. It's hard to read that essay without flinching. At least I cannot.
It's a very, very difficult essay and very hard to find. Now, are there questions from the audience? I'm waiting here for some questions, but as yet I can see none entering my area, which is a surprise. So let us continue a little further. And let me ask a little bit about your sense then of Arendt's, when she writes about labor and she writes about work and she writes about the vita activa. I wondered how much you thought that constructed negatively, as it were, people who couldn't live up to that sense of enlarged minds, that sense of grandeur, or that sense of the really heroic life. Do you think she dismissed in any way the people who couldn't do what she did? Was that the arrogance that upset?
I think that actually the distinctions between labor and work in particular are about Arendt's conversation with Marxism. And it doesn't have anything to do with her contempt for the working people. That's just a truncated reading of the text. And there is this wonderful section in the Human Condition that talks about the heroic chapter of the European working classes. Now, the reason why it is a conversation with Marx is that, and she says as much, in these pages, Karl Marx will be criticized. She, I believe, uncovered an interesting ambiguity, ambivalence, conflation, really, in the concept, in Marx's concept of Arbeit, and the relationship between work and labor. And she says in almost all European languages, and maybe in others as well, Arbeit und Werk, work and labor, are distinct. And she makes this very correct point about Marx. I mean, we're getting into the weeds a little bit. This may seem pedantic, but that what Marx attributes to labor, particularly in his early writings, is what we usually associate with the quality of work, namely that in the object of work, one sees oneself realized, that the activity of work is also a form of, quote unquote, remember the phrase from Marx, of species realization. And Arendt points out too, very correctly, that a lot of labor is repetitive. Mm. And a lot of labor, is focused upon the needs of the body. To use a phrase from Locke, the labor of our bodies and the work of our hands. The distinction between the object of labor and the object of work is that the object of work persists. Buildings, artifacts, furniture, even just like poetry, music. These are objects that have independence from their maker, as opposed to the laboring activity that basically is caught in what she calls the metabolismic cycle of life. And her critique of Marx is that Marx wants to transform industrial activity into work. Mm. That will be satisfying, that will be gratifying, that will be a source of self-realization. And her point is that this is not possible. Whether mechanized or work or automated work, there is going to be a certain necessity and repetitiveness to it. I think that this is actually a very important insight, and I think it accounts for a lot of confusion about what exactly Marx meant by non-alienated labor. Yes. In his early writings.
Thank you. We have one question from the audience, which is, both these women are political philosophers, were émigrés. And to what extent do you think their political viewpoints were determined by their émigré status?
I would think that in Arendt's case, much more so than in Shklar's case. Mm. After all, Shklar came to Harvard when she was 21 and lived her life there in a rather, a stable life with 3 children, etc. But in Shklar as well, let me put it this way. Let me just go back for a second to her writing. Her first book is Against Utopia, right? Emerging out of her dissertation. The book in which she is really coming to grips with the Second World War, in my opinion, is the book on legalism, on law and morals, and the attempt to create a rule of law and a legal order in societies that are not, that have to deal also with the question of war crimes, Nazi war crimes, Japanese war crimes. But increasingly, Shklar also moves towards the kind of communication, the kind of of American academia, Anglo political theory, but in an interesting way, towards the end of her life, she comes back to the question of obligation, loyalty, and exile. Those are her final lectures that she delivers at Harvard, and we only have 1 or 2 long essays. So you might ask yourself, why does she come back to this topic? And it's the first time also that she says some very explicit things about refugees and the refugee condition. So the Emigré existence, the memories of the Emigré existence do not completely disappear. I think in Arendt's case, she loved America. She saw its weaknesses, and in particular, she was deeply grateful to the United States that offered her citizenship as well as the possibility to unfold herself. And as Shklar herself notes about Arendt's work on revolution, Shklar says justifiably, this is a love letter to the American Revolution and a sort of dumbing down of the French Revolution. Right? Mm-hmm. So it was one time when Arendt did idealize the moderns. It was when she talked about the American Revolution and its legacy in that book. But she got increasingly worried about the United States in the 60s. And, that's when her collection of essays, Crises of the Republic, emerges.
Yeah.
Right. She was worried, about what she called the Madison Avenue tactics of American politics, that it's all advertisement, that it's all hype. Of course, she was worried about the rule of technocrats and number crunchers in the Vietnam War, who were so far from reality. And she was also very ambivalent about the American student movement. On the one hand, she glorified and supported the civil rights. Well, no, I take that back. You may know, even in her writings on the civil rights movement, the famous essay on Little Rock, integration, right? Then the Black students uprising and resistance in Columbia and Cornell, Arendt started losing her foothold in contemporary American politics, and she started judging everything through the lens of the Emigré. Anyway, this is a different question, but I don't think you can understand much of her writings on the question of Black resistance, Black liberation, school integration, without sensing, her fear. Oh boy, things are beginning to happen again here that are just not good.
Sure.
They're going to lead to a kind of breakdown of the liberal constitutional order. So in that sense, yes, the Emigré experience is there throughout. Yeah.
Well, we have two more questions. We're going to take those two questions and then we're going to finish. First question from Paul Dolan is, trite though it might be, how much of the basis of criticism by Shklar of Arendt is the result just of generational gap and therefore different philosophical agendas, albeit with a certain acerbity? But it wouldn't be the first time that we saw different generations of strong women arguing with each other. So is that a fair point?
Yes, it certainly is part of the dimension, but I think truly there is much more to it than that. I mean, she clearly is going back to Arendt's work several times, and 1975, I believe, is the last Arendt essay. And if I may be permitted a personal note here, when I was associate professor at Harvard and her colleague, and I was working on my book in 1996 that was published in 1996, The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt, Shklar said to me, "Why are you all working on Hannah Arendt again?" This was a little bit, intimidating, and I don't think I had tenure yet there. And I said, "Oh boy, this doesn't bode well." But she was truly surprised by the interest that women of my generation showed in the Arendt revival. She couldn't get over it. There was something odd for her. So it's certainly there may have been a generational moment, but there is also this question of her own astonishment at the rediscovery of Arendt by the younger generation.
She'd be even more surprised now with the last 10 years, with again the resurgence of Arendt. But the final question comes from someone, I don't know who it's from, it's an anonymous question. It says, you said Shklar wrote 5 essays about Arendt, but do you think she was also implicitly responding to Arendt in her other work? And if so, which writings are most important for understand the relationship between Shklar and Arendt?
Great question. Great question. I think the most explicit work is legalism, because here she's dealing with the topic also of Eichmann in Jerusalem, where she's writing about war crimes. And she's covering much the same ground. And she also says one of her most critical things about Arendt. What she says, Arendt really did not understand the law very well. Legal theory was not her forte. But of course, this was one of Shklar's fortes. She had a very good, sharp understanding of post-war legal theory disputes, and went on to write very interestingly about the rule of law and so on. And it seems to me as if also ordinary vices, as the quotations also that Simon was reading out, definitely there is a kind of back and forth there, and possibly American citizenship. Now, American citizenship is, again, it was based on her Storrs lectures at Harvard. The reason why American citizenship is also interesting is because the question of standing through work comes up, standing through wage labor. And here to go back, to the labor-work distinction, Shklar shows how much of a modern person she is. Because she doesn't just consider wage labor from the standpoint of the exploitation of the workers, injustice in the factories, etc. She considers wage labor in terms of the standing it permits the worker in a republic, as opposed to the slave who does not own his or her labor and the fruits of that. And there as well, one could do some very interesting thinking. But it sounds as if there are going to be many more dissertations or theses to be had in this topic.
Well, Seyla, thanks very much. We've touched on so many issues of real importance, not just for Arendt and for Shklar, but for the whole of what we're dealing with at the moment in terms of what political action is, how we might relate to each other, what cruelty is, the need for heroic action and its norming into mundane behavior. And so there's been an awful lot here that I think has been absolutely en point for today's politics. Thank you very much for your generosity. And thank you all very much to everybody who's been listening. And thank you to the staff who helped put it together in the technical side. And that is the end. Thank you all very much.